my pleasure to introduce someone I've been in correspondence with for multiple years, who was kind enough to reach out to me years ago when I was first writing about the problem of information overload and share some of what he was doing. Author and consultant Steuart Snooks with 3 strategies for managing information overload. Steuart?
Good. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of 3 strategies for managing overload, and that's come out of my experience working in Australia over the last 11 years with lots of people in workshops and conference presentations and coaching. And we'll look at 3 things: the impact of overload, we'll have a quick look at that, what we can do about it, and then the 3 practical strategies. There's quite a fair bit of information, lots of slides, so keep your eyeballs on the screen. And treat it as a bit of a smorgasbord. Just take the things that are most relevant for you and let it pass if it's not. The first thing I wanted to show you was the impact of email overload. And this, Jonathan, you would know about this slide. It shows the pace of information overload and how information has increased exponentially in our generation. It just makes you wonder what it's going to be like in future years. And getting information off the internet, as this slide says, it's like trying to drink from a fire hydrant. There's just so much choice. There's just a complete overload. What I've found from the research and the talking with people is that 66% of that, about 2/3 of that overload, tends to be coming from email. If you ask about overload, email is almost the first thing that people mention. And 80% of that email tends to be non-essential. There's a lot of noise, not enough signal. And I like what Timothy Ferriss says about this. These days, for most people, email is probably one of the biggest time wasters and source of frustration. It's the old tragedy of the commons. It's become so overused by most people that it's almost useless to any of us. However, there are ways to get control of it. Forbes magazine said that email is the leading cause of preventable productivity loss in organisations today. And what I found is that email has now become absolutely central to most of what we do in the modern business. It's like dropping a stone into a pond. It has a ripple effect throughout the organisation on a whole range of functionalities. I challenge you to think of something that happens in your organisation that hasn't gone through an inbox at some stage. It's just become the centre point in the modern age. Just quickly flick through some of the numbers, the stats. We're handling huge amounts, 108 a day. That's more than 25,000 a year. If that was in physical form, we wouldn't even try or think that we could keep up. But somehow, because it's electronic, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to think that we can keep up. And email's not going away. There has been a rise of social media. There's an increase of that, but it's not taking away from email, it's adding to email. It's actually voice calls and text messages, instant messaging that seems to be on the decline. Email is still growing, and in the business world at the rate of around 12 to 13% a year. So we can't avoid the problem. Email's not dead. We do need to take some steps to address it. And a lot of the problem comes because it arrives as an interruption. It's one of many interruptions that we get. People are switching applications multiple times an hour. In fact, I was listening to a podcast just an hour ago, which talked about a Wall Street Journal article that says that people check their iPhones on average 80 times a day. It's amazing, isn't it? 80 times a day. A lot of the information that comes in, one of our biggest problems is that there's too little relevance. There's a lot of noise and only a very little bit of signal. And I think the old Pareto principle works there. 80% of it's non-essential, 20% of it is essential. From my own research here in Australia, working with companies prior to workshops where we've run surveys, I'm finding these sort of numbers. 42% of email doesn't require a response. 32% would actually be better communicated verbally, either face-to-face or on the phone. And 1 in 4 are not even related to a role at all. They're the sort of circulars that go out to all staff. And this slide here talks about the fact that 61% of the day is lost, is caught up in information and email overload. And that was 5 years ago. I imagine it has snuck up a little higher, if anything. And as a result of that, most of us are struggling with overloaded inboxes. I find more and more that people have just left things in the inbox. They've given up trying to move it out of there. But there are answers. And I've collated the research from around the world into a a white paper called The 7 Critical Impacts of Email and Information Overload, and you can see them there for yourself. A lot of information arrives as an interruption, causes us to lose focus. We now start to multitask. Our decision making isn't what it could have been, and so on and so forth. You can see the rest there. And the 8th impact is that it has an impact on our quality of life and our work-life balance, which we never used to have in years gone by. As a result of that, I find that most of us sit on this email mastery model, and at the bottom level, we're overloaded or overwhelmed simply by the volumes and the amount of information, the time it takes, the energy it takes from us, the attention that's needed. And in fact, 60% of people that I ask when I put up the model would put their hand up and say, yes, I'm in the red zone. But a lot of us have learned to survive. We're getting by. We're struggling, but we do what we need to survive. But we're, as a result of that, falling behind with our key work, and a lot of the time we're only getting to our most important functions just in time, or perhaps even when they're overdue. But we can become effective. We can learn how to use email as a business process and ultimately smart. And finally, we can master email. And as you move up this model, it's taking less time, less effort, less attention, and we're having greater control. So a key question here for you, and I suppose it's a rhetorical question, is, looking at this model, where do you feel that you sit now? And thinking about that, the next question, of course, is where would you like to be? And I'm sure all of us would agree that it's not much fun at the bottom levels, and we all want to be moving up towards mastery. But perhaps we can't get there in one step. We need to move on. And so let's have a quick look at what we can do about it. What I have found is that the solution is a process, not a one-off event. You can't wave the wand and fix a problem that we've slowly got ourselves into over time. And that the solution involves changing our behavior, not just improving technology. You've probably all had upgrades to your email software over the years. And has that solved your problem? No. What I find is technology simply leverages our decisions, whether they're good or bad. If we've got good decision-making and a good process, technology will leverage that for good, and it will also leverage it for not so good. And one of the things that I try to help people get is a paradigm shift away from their inbox, away from being inbox-based, interruption-driven, largely reactive in the way that they work day in, day out, to something that's rather calendar-based and or plan-driven, focused, and proactive. It's obviously a much more productive way to work. It's a much more satisfying way to work, rather than constantly being in and out of the inbox and driven by other people's agendas. Now, I've put together this next slide, and it's a little bit rustic. It's my first draft, if you like, but it's a bit of a graphic to show a large amount of information coming into our world from the left-hand side. And of course, it's not just email. We have instant messaging and a range of social media and other platforms. And we're trying to get it through our inbox or in tray or wherever it is that we have data landing. And hopefully when we finish with it, we're filing it somewhere. So that gives us a bit of a heads up as to where we can start to apply some effort in terms of our strategies. And so we're going to have a quick look at those now. And the 3 strategies that I am going to show you, I was inspired by Timothy Ferriss's white paper on the low information diet, how to eliminate email overload and triple your productivity in 24 hours. He talks about these 3 steps, and I elaborate them in a slightly different way to him in my workshops, but I think they're 3 great big picture steps to have in mind. And the first of those is to decrease the frequency with which we're checking our sources of information. I mean, how many times a day do we need to check the news? How many times a day do we need to check all of the various sources of incoming data? And the 3 sub-steps of that are, I have found, is we should schedule times to check our social media, to check our email, to check the news, rather than simply be interrupted anytime it happens to arrive, or it's even better than checking them ad hoc. And once we have a schedule in place, once we know when we're going to spend our time and attention and our mental focus and energy on that, we can turn off all the alerts so that we are in control of our thinking span and our attention. And then we can also begin to manage expectations. What are other people expecting in terms of promptness of response? Given that I find a large majority of the interactions are within our own organisations or within a small group, we can manage their expectations. And there's all sorts of ways that you can do that around response rates. Just to elaborate on scheduling times, Nathan himself has written this guide a couple of years ago, on the solutions to information overload, and I recommend it to you if you haven't got it. It's on Nathan's own site, and it has 164 known solutions to information overload. Now, 66% of them, 66 of those are apps. 98 of them are behaviours, either individually or for a department or for a whole organisation. But the number one solution that Nathan recommends is to read email only in predefined daily time slots. Same as I call it, schedule those times. Not ad hoc, not at random, not certainly not as you're interrupted. There are very few roles where you're completely reliant on incoming email for your next task or activity. And as he says, this is probably the single most important change that any one of us can make to get a control of personal information overload, wherever it's coming from, not just email. And Timothy Ferris, who I referred to earlier, he also says this habit alone, this habit of only checking at scheduled times can change your life. It seems to be a small thing, but it has an enormous effect. My feedback from working with thousands of clients over the last 10, 11 years would indicate that that's one of the biggest things, is the ability to turn off alerts and have more time and attention for the things that really matter. So that's the first of the three strategies. The second one is to reduce the volume that we're trying to handle, particularly trying to handle manually. And the 4 sub-steps of that are obviously to unsubscribe. If it's not relevant to you, maybe you did sign up, at one point it was of interest or a particular thing was of interest, unsubscribe from that and stop it coming to you in the first place. The second one is to filter and sort. Obviously you want to filter and sort. You may wish some information to keep coming, but you're not focused on that issue right now. So you might set up a rule for it to go somewhere else, or you might delete this edition knowing that the next one's going to come in. And so there's a way to create rules and to automate some of the processing of incoming information, so it automatically goes to the allocated areas that get your attention at the appropriate time. And of course, one of the biggest factors, often overlooked in reducing volume, is to actually send less email, send less social media postings yourself. The more we send, the more we're going to get back. It's a pretty simple equation. So they're the 4 steps for reducing volume. I saw this interesting stat that 75% of what people complain about is spam is things they've actually signed up for. So people complain a lot about getting noise and complaining about the spam, but if you want to do online banking, shopping, download an app, if you want to do anything online these days, you tend to have to give out your email address, and that means you're going to get stuff coming back in. So make the decision to unsubscribe if it's not relevant anymore, or use a rule or a filter to allocate it into an appropriate place. I like this quote by Clay Shirky about it's not information overload, it's filter failure. As we know, you just walk outside and you're hit with an enormous amount of information. We need to filter that according to our own personal preferences and needs. So that's a wrap up of the second strategy. And the last strategy is to increase the speed of processing the information that is remaining. And the 3 sub-steps of that are: make the determination that we're going to handle email or messages just once. Our time is too valuable to ever look at an email more than once. We need a process that allows us to touch it once and move it on. And that's why it's so important to decrease the frequency and schedule the time so that we are actually giving it our mental attention and focus to make the decision that's needed to move it on once we've looked at it. So our aim then should be to process to 0, whether it's the inbox or the voicemail, the in-tray, and then file quickly, to be able to quickly file off those that are needed if we're not deleting them, but we do have to keep them, to be able to file very quickly. And just to elaborate a little bit on that handle at once, here's one of the reasons. It's called the Zeigarnik effect, and it's named after a Soviet psychologist from the 1920s, Bluma Zeigarnik, who, by noticing Italian waiters, funnily enough, she noticed that we remember incomplete, unfinished, interrupted tasks better than when we've done something. These Italian waiters could remember deliver orders that they had not yet delivered to table. They could tell you the person and their order. But once they delivered, they instantly forgot, and they forgot what they'd ordered to who. And in my workshops, I ask people, just make a list of 10 things that you got done yesterday. And people really struggle to think through what they got completed. But if I ask them to make a list of 10 things that they need to do today, they say, gee, only 10? You know, all of these things are top of mind because we've looked at an email, or a social media post, but we haven't taken action. But some part of our subconscious brain is now trying to keep track of what's going on. And of course, it wears us out and overloads us. And then in terms of processing to zero, here's the 4D method that all of the great time management gurus over the years have talked about. Brian Tracy, Stephen Covey, David Allen these days will talk about a 4D process of one form or another. This is the one that I recommend to people, is that we just make one of these 4 decisions the first time you touch, particularly an email, but any incoming source of information. And I think it's fairly obvious there. I won't read it out for you. And then the last thing to make mention of is the ability to file quickly. And we can simplify our email folder structure. Some people have folders and subfolders and subfolders of subfolders, and it goes on. And we need to reduce the number of folders because it makes the decision that much easier. The other thing is that I heard a colleague say 95% of what goes into an email folder is never looked at again. So we're better off putting that energy into managing priorities and activities and looking ahead rather than behind. And a simple system will allow that filing to be done almost at one click. And of course, a simple folder structure is going to make it easier when we are on the go or using mobile technology. So there it is. There's the 3 strategies that I think have made a big difference to being able to manage the volumes of information and email overload. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much.